The rules of punctuation in English are usually pretty straightforward. Use a period at the end of a sentence. Use quotation marks when quoting direct speech. But when it comes to the correct use of commas, you will often find different rules depending on who you ask. The so-called Oxford comma, also known as the serial comma, is probably the most often debated use. Let's look at a few example sentences and see how serial commas are used. Here's the first sentence. My friend speaks English and German. Since there are only two items in the list, English and German, we use the conjunction word and. Notice there is no comma in this sentence. If we add another item to this list, in this case a third language, we would get a sentence like this. My friend speaks English, German, and Polish. Now things get tricky. We see a comma between the words English and German. No problem. That belongs there. But should we add a comma after the word German? Some writers would argue yes, while others would say no. So let's look at some situations where this little comma can have a big impact. Here's another example sentence. My father invited his cousins, Peter and Tom. In this sentence, we see three items in the list. His cousins, Peter, and Tom. If we use the Oxford comma, that's the comma in red. Then it is clear that we have three distinct items, or in this case, people. But if we remove that comma, something strange happens. Someone reading this sentence now might think that Peter and Tom are actually my father's cousins, because the structure of the sentence looks like a so-called apposition. In the case of this sentence, the names Peter and Tom would now be identifying who my father's cousins are. This means, instead of three distinct items or people, his cousins Peter and Tom, we only have two items, Peter and Tom. And those two names identify the names of my father's cousins. Remember, all we did was remove the comma after the name Peter. But by doing that, the reader must make a choice between two possible interpretations of the sentence. With the Oxford comma, there is only one possible interpretation. To conclude, let's compare our two example sentences. My friend speaks English, German, and Polish. And my father invited his cousins, Peter and Tom. In the sentence on the left, using or not using the Oxford comma will not change the meaning of the sentence. There is only one interpretation possible. My friend speaks three languages. Therefore, some writers argue that it is not necessary to use the Oxford comma here. In the sentence on the right, as we have already seen, when not using the Oxford comma, the reader would have to make a choice about how they understand the sentence. For this reason, it would be beneficial to use the Oxford comma to avoid confusion for the reader. The debate is simple. Should we use the Oxford comma in both situations, including in sentences like the first one where it doesn't really help the reader? Or should we only use it when it is necessary to provide clarity, like in the second sentence? That, in the end, is up to the personal preference of the writer themselves. But as a reader, I know which version I prefer.